Hi there, music appreciation class. This is Mr. Kimball here for our second lecture of the third 9 weeks. This one is titled Streams of American Popular Music. So when we think about America and the influences that we have here, we really need to think about three streams. And those streams are respectively European American, Latin American, and African American. So we're going to dive right in here to talking about the European American influence on music in America. The European American stream was the central focus of American popular music until the mid-19th century, largely because of British rule leading up to that point. One of the major aspects of music that we take from England and Europe, for that matter, is the ballad tradition. So a ballad is a type of song in which a series of verses tell a story. So one melody set to a bunch of different words, and those words tend to have a progression of climax and development and resolution. So we're telling a story with our words, our lyrics. And then later on, and whenever we have a song that is different words set to the same tune, that song is called strophic. It's a strophic form. That's a compositional tool used in music. Later on, though, composers and songwriters would add choruses in between those verses. So we would add a chorus in between each verse. So the verse would tell the story. The chorus would be a different melody, but it would be catchy, and it would use repeating lyrics each time you heard it. So verse with new lyrics, chorus with the same lyrics. So verse, then chorus, then new lyrics in the verse, but the same lyrics in the next chorus. Another totally different type or style of music that we got from Europe was dance music. So think all the way back to the Baroque era in the time of Bach and Handel and Haydn. We had gigues and berets and different dance steps like that. So we would play music in a ballroom setting or in a court setting, and people would dance to it. That was the purpose of music, was to be able to dance to it in the royal court. So we kind of, that tradition progressed in Europe, and it led to country dances. And country dances were things like the contra dance, the quadrille, the reel, and the square dance. And then that was brought over to America. Today, we can still see influences in terms of dance music with things like line dancing. That's a European idea. So that's one other major aspect there. Another is folk music. Folk music is kind of widespread, but when we consider folk music, we want to think of the hills of Ireland and just general rural areas in which not really commercialized music came from. So it's sort of not country music, but people music. And then lastly, a lot of religious influence also came from Europe. So whenever we think of spirituals, we tend to associate that with African Americans. But in all honesty, the idea of spirituals actually came from Europe. So a spiritual is a type of song. It's a body of sacred songs that are meant to be very, very high energy and exciting. And really, a person, when singing a spiritual, is supposed to embody the Holy Spirit, which is why the term is called spiritual. So this was a different idea because way back when in the Catholic Church, we had this sort of idea that only choirs and only professionally trained musicians should be performing music in church. Well, the spiritual sort of takes that formal notion and makes it a little bit less formal, but way more high energy. This is fun stuff to sing and fun stuff to listen to. And the reason that came to be was because of the Separatist Baptist movement, which was pretty big back in the mid-19th century and even a little bit before that. But the Separatist Baptist movement believed that music texts and religious expression should be intensely personal and really high energy. It shouldn't be all formal and stuffy. So anyways, that came from that. And lastly, the call and response technique, which is when we hear this all the time in music. One voice, one instrument, one thing makes a call, and then another voice or instrument makes a response. It's a really common compositional technique. That actually comes from this gathering known as camp meetings, and camp meetings were early revival type things back in Europe, and it was very religious. So a camp meeting meeting was an open-air religious service that would attract a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different denominations. And what would happen is you would have a pastor or some religious leader stand in the center of this meeting, and they would sing a line from a hymn, and then everybody around would respond with the next line. So it would be one person singing, and then the entire congregation that was there responding. Sometimes it would just be a direct call and response, so I would sing one line, and then somebody would repeat it back to me. So that was another idea that kind of came from Europe there. Moving on here, we're going to dive into the African American stream. So when we talk about the African American stream, we obviously have to talk about slavery, just from the pure essence that African American influence came to America because of slavery. That's how African Americans that's how African Americans got to America, is through the slave trade. So the population of these newly arrived slaves made up a lot of a diverse society. It really diversified the people that were here. Not only because people were coming from a totally different continent. We had Europe and Africa now, but we also have to remember that in a lot of cases, the slaves didn't just come directly from Africa. What would happen is that they would be taken from Africa, but then they would be taken to places like England or France or the Caribbean. They would serve as slaves there, and then later be traded to America and sold to different slave owners there. So what kind of happened are, not only were slaves bringing their own African culture with them, but they were also picking up aspects of all of these different cultures that they stopped at before they even got to America. And it was sort of this really diverse mix of cultures that were kind of brought over with slavery. One of the really important aspects that we got from slavery were work songs, lullabies, story songs, and black spirituals. Sorry, there's a little bit more than one there, but work songs would be songs that, pretty simple here, songs that slaves would sing while they work. It would be some way for them to pass the time while working. Lullabies would be songs that female slaves would sing to their children. Story songs are a bit like ballads in that it would be verses to tell a story, so they were kind of similar there. And then black spirituals are somewhat similar to the spirituals we just discussed in the European American tradition. However, there was one big difference. Black spirituals were sort of code songs. Slaves would hide codes in these lyrics that would talk about like moving to the north and becoming free. One of the most common, I think, slave songs that I know anyways is "Follow the Drinking Gourd." "Follow the Drinking Gourd" obviously is a song about following the Big Dipper in the sky, the constellation of the Big Dipper, because the Big Dipper contains the North Star, and if you follow the North Star for long enough, then you're obviously going to end up in the north. So that's kind of one of those code songs. Now, I guess that one's not really religious in nature, but it's a code song nonetheless. A more religious one would be "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." We can find a lot of commonalities between the lyrics in that and traveling to the north. Like, for instance, one of the lyrics in "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" is, "If you get there before I do, coming forth to carry me home. Tell all my friends I'm coming too, coming forth to carry me home." So if we just think of that in terms of going north and being a slave and trying to get to freedom, it's really easy to make that connection. So anyways, that's black spirituals. We also have to remember that Christianity wasn't really a thing in Africa. That was a very European idea. So slaves would come over to America, and their masters would sort of push Christianity onto the slaves. Well, the slaves adopted this credo with Christianity that all Christians are equal in the eyes of God. So if you're hearing that as an enslaved person, you would obviously automatically connect that if all Christians are equal in the eyes of God, then everyone should be free. And that was really important and led to the Great Awakening in the early 19th century amongst slaves, in which they were kind of converting to evangelical Christianity through the help, not really help, but through the suggestion of their masters. One more thing to consider here is that slave owners were not very not very open to the idea of slaves practicing religion on their own. They wanted to have total control. So they would encourage religious practice among slaves, but only when they would be at white-controlled churches. Nonetheless, slaves still created these things called hush quarters in which they could practice these songs and practice these not ceremonies, but practice this religion without the influence of the white owner. So it was actually very, very cool how these slaves developed codes in Black spirituals through these hush quarters. So just some neat backstory there, and some important stuff for you to know. Whenever we think of African American influence in music, and specifically in musical terms, we need to think of four major things: polyrhythms, syncopation, backbeat, and improvisation. Polyrhythms are when we have multiple rhythms interlocking with one another. So, for instance, a polyrhythm could be if this is one rhythm I'm playing, and this is another rhythm I'm playing, and I interlock those, I would have this. So that's one example of polyrhythm. It's not just two rhythms interlocking, it's a bunch of rhythms interlocking, or at least more than one, but oftentimes a ton. And that was really a big concept dating all the way back to West Africa and thinking of drums and tribal music. Polyrhythms really were important. So another important concept is syncopation, and syncopation is when we put emphasis on the offbeat. The offbeat would be really anything aside from the primary and secondary pulses. So when we kind of move that emphasis to things that are a bit harder to feel, that's called syncopation. It's something that's really tough to talk about, but you know it when it's happening. Backbeat is the weaker beat. So if we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, the backbeats are actually the even beats. So it'd be 2 and 4. When we listen to the backbeat, this is a really common concept in drum set playing. We hit the snare on 2 and 4. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's called the backbeat. Improvisation is when we I don't want to say make up, but it's really just an interaction between performers in which we're performing music that's not necessarily written out for us. It's a tradition that once again dates back to West Africa and drumming in tribal music. Improvisation is when we don't have that music all spelled out for us and we kind of have to make things up, but within a context that's really structured. So that's improvisation. Huge in jazz music, which is another huge African American influence in and of itself, and blues, which is a very African American influenced genre, and things like that. So anyways, that's the African American stream. And next we have the Latin American stream, and we're going to take a quick pause here to give you your first keyword of the day. The first keyword is going to be call, C-A-L-L, call. So that first keyword is call. Thinking about the Latin American stream, this is probably the one that I'm the least familiar with, just from my studies and my listening habits. But from the Latin American stream, we have things like the contradanza, the habanera, the tango, the rumba, and several other sounds and rhythms. A lot of our grooves and backbeats are Latin American influenced in nature, even in some of our pop music. I don't tend to listen to things with a heavy Latin American influence, not for any particular reason other than it just isn't in my typical listening preferences. But most of these refer to a specific rhythm or rhythmic idea. And some of these refer to a dance step, like the tango is not only a type of music, but also a type of dance. So that's kind of the connection there with Latin America. So now we're going to just spend a very brief amount of time here talking about popular music of the 19th and early 20th century in America. It's not going to be much, and we'll dive more into this in our next week's lecture. But when we're talking about popular music of the 19th and early 20th century, What we want to think about first is a sort of darker part of our history, a more unfortunate part of our history that deals quite a bit with racism and those ideas. So this first little bit that we're going to talk about is a theatrical performance and a form of musical entertainment known as the minstrel show. This is important because it was widely regarded around the world as the first form of entertainment, first form of music that was distinctly American. It was the first American form of music. Everything else was either, music that the slaves were performing was African, and music that that some of the whites were performing was European. But this was the first thing that was considered to be really American. The reason it's such an unfortunate part of our history is because a minstrel show is a show in which largely white performers artificially blacken their skin and enact parodies of African American music, dance, and dialect. So what we have here are white performers taking African American culture and turning it into something. It's kind of a mixture of European and African American culture here, because we had white performers performing African American things, but they were doing so in a very offensive way. They were making fun of it. It was a comedy sketch. One of the important figures here is George Washington Dixon, and he was the first white performer to establish a wide reputation as a blackface entertainer. He debuted in New York City in 1892 and performed two songs that really grew in popularity, titled Long Tail Blue and Coal Black Rose. He performed both of those in blackface. And while I know what I said was that they were white performers performing African American songs to make fun of them, but in all reality, they were just stealing bits from African American culture. The songs that they were performing were more European than they were African. They were more ballads, and they were more heavily influenced by the European tradition than they were the African tradition. Another figure is Thomas Dartmouth Rice. He was a white actor born into a poor family in New York's 7th Ward. So he was a very disenfranchised person. He was a very, very poor upbringing. And he wrote the song Jim Crow, which became the first international American song hit. And if you've heard of Jim Crow laws, that should sound familiar. It's based on this song. So Rice also imitated this African dance called the cakewalk. And this has a kind of funny backstory here. The cakewalk is actually, it came to be because slaves watched their owners perform a European American dance called the quadrille. So the quadrille is actually just a European dance that fancy people would perform, and slaves watched this, and they ironically were making fun of their owners because they looked silly while performing it. So slaves created this parody of their owners doing their very stuffy and fancy dance. And the owners watched the slaves do this and thought that they were just trying to imitate them, and didn't realize that they were being made fun of. So it kind of, the cakewalk is actually the slaves making fun of the stuffy dance, the quadrille. And then what was happening here was Thomas Dartmouth Rice took it and was using it to make fun of slaves, not knowing the real history behind it. So I hope that all made sense. It's kind of irony on top of irony there. Another pretty interesting tidbit here is a song called Zippity Doo-Dah. Zippity Doo-Dah should sound familiar if you've ever been to Walt Disney World. It's on it's on the ride Splash Mountain, and it comes from the movie Song of the South, which has some racial undertones in and of itself. But Zippity Doo-Dah is actually a descendant from a minstrel show song in which the lyrics were Zip-a-doodin' doodin' doodin' zip-a-doodin' day. So you can tell that they're pretty similar there. And that really plays into the racial undertones of, you know, Song of the South and that whole Walt Disney movie, just because you can't really take something from a song that was normally performed in blackface and remove the racial the poor racial influence from it. So some more information for you there. Then comes along the Virginia Minstrels, which were a touring performance group that really standardized the minstrel show. We added characters that would be commonly seen. So kind of think of this like it's tough to explain, but think of this like a traveling theater in which they really came up with characters that would then be seen in every minstrel show you'd see everywhere. Now, I'm not saying that it was the same actors. I'm saying different actors would perform the same characters. So that's some more info there for you. And then we come to a really common American theme. The minstrel show started off as poor white actors performing comedy sketches to make fun of African Americans. And then what it turned into was something that became a mass phenomenon and leading up to the Civil War. And people took it, standardized it, and it became much more rigidly stereotyped. It was already pretty stereotyped, but it became much more rigid, and they had the same sets of stereotypes. And this is a really common pattern in American music. We take a new genre of music that arises in a marginalized community, that would be poor white communities, and then moves into mainstream popular culture. So it became a really important part of our culture. And then it lost a lot of that really rebellious energy that gave rise to it in the first place. So it lost a lot of that in becoming standardized. We'll see that in progressions of rock and roll and grunge rock and punk rock and jazz and disco. And we see that with almost every genre that comes to be in America. Is it starts off in a marginalized community and then it becomes standardized and it sort of loses that real rebellious feel to it. The minstrel show also led to, and the touring of the minstrel shows also led to vaudeville. Vaudeville was a kind of variety show that became really dominant in the late 19th century, so the late 1800s and early 1900s in America. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. But that's really all of the info I've got for you. I will say that sort of towards the end of, leading up to the Civil War, we would actually have African Americans perform in minstrel shows, and that was rather unfortunate because basically African American actors and performers couldn't find jobs unless they were willing to make fun of themselves, which and it's not making fun of themselves in a lighthearted nature. It was very, very racist and a very, very sad part of our history. But I think it's important to talk about nonetheless, because when we talk about American music, we have to realize that these racially charged experiences have been a part of our history for basically since the very beginning. So I hope you found this lecture somewhat informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. We will be going over this stuff. I imagine if you're listening to this, you're probably not going to be attending the Teams meeting because we'll just be going over this again. But if you feel the need to or would like to ask me any questions, I'm definitely here for you. Just send it to me over Teams. All right, good luck, guys. Don't forget to do the Microsoft form after you're done listening. Oh, yeah, and last but not least, the second keyword for this week is response. So you want to go back about 10 minutes or so to hear the first keyword, but the second keyword is response, and that is RESPONSE, response. All right, thank you so much, guys.